Here, as promised, is the reading aloud of my latest article that was published in Psychic World newspaper, and it's called Time and Space Are Relative in More Ways Than One to a Spiritualist. Albert Einstein's theory that time and space are not as immutable and fixed as people are geared to thinking that they are from their experience of everyday life is an easy one to accept by spiritualists. His proposition that time itself slows down or speeds up according to where someone is standing in this material world and whether they are physically moving or not, and at what height they are away from the surface of the earth, also looks at the effect gravity has on our physical experience of time. It occurred to him that during the act of physically falling, a human being doesn't feel their own weight, prompting him to further develop his theory before he announced it to the world. In spiritualist development circles, we learn that in order to connect with the hitherto unseen by us other world, inhabited by those now discarnate, we have to speed up our own frequency from the slow and heavy vibration of our physical selves to one that matches as much as humanly possible with theirs. Inhabitants of the etheric realms of light have to slow their own frequency in order to connect with us. Fortunately, modern spiritualism was founded by a dear one who was not so highly evolved that he couldn't slow down into this gross wavelength fairly easily, although guided, of course, by those whose connections with the earth plane are much more rarefied. And he was able to generate loud bangs to catch the attention of a family of young women who were of simple faith, but sensitive enough to be prompted mentally to actually inquire of the noisy visitor who he was. Developed as mediums proper, and the rest is literally history. And in this manner that we now call physical mediumship, table turning, etc., many are convinced that there is a life after this one, without having to personally try to develop the mediumship necessary for individual personal contact. Similarly, they can access spirit side messages and teachings from mediums who have developed their abilities in what is now termed mental mediumship. But supposing there has been no such development in striving to achieve otherworldly communications, or people who are unaware of this facility, although loved ones would still like to get the fact of their survival and continued care for those still here on earth through to them directly. There are ways and means used by those in the spirit realms to manoeuvre situations, especially for our benefit, that are beyond our understanding. But it is done all the time. Take what happened between my neighbour and me the other day. I'll tell you more. Harry Wedge was born on the 16th of December 1880 and passed to spirit 1st of October 1939. A spiritualist funeral was held for the much loved and respected church organist Harry Wedge in October 1939. He was an accomplished musician who played for services in Barrow-in-Furness at the Barrow Dalkeith Street and Ulverston Spiritualist churches. Both churches were represented officially by Dalkeith's Mr. and Mrs. J. Kellett, Mrs. M. A. Smith, Mrs. J. White, Mrs. S. Collins, Mrs. P. Harris and Mrs. Hall. Ulverston by Mrs. Hartley and Mrs. Gateskill. The funeral service was held at the Barrow Spiritualist Church and continued at the graveside at St. Michael's Rampside, taken by spiritualist officiant James E. Rice. Harry Wedge was also well liked by his work colleagues, and 8 of them were his pallbearers. Head foreman Mr. Fallows, together with Messrs. S. Milligan, J. Neal, W. M. McClellan, W. Bailey, C. Fagan, N. Turber and Mr. McCulloch. Why am I reporting this event to you 80 years later, you may wonder? I was minding my own business, you might say, doing a bit of deadheading in the front garden, and out of sight of the road, I was surprised to find suddenly joining me amongst the roses a neighbour, Constance Clark. She had a small parcel in her hands, and holding it out in my direction said, "I thought you might like to have this, as when I've gone it will only go in a skip." I smiled sympathetically, because those of us blessed with an abundance of years have similar concerns for our belongings that are treasured only by us. It was my grandfather's, Constance continued. I opened the paper wrapping and was taken aback. I recognised the dark, good quality binding and size of the book, now in my hand. The embossed title I know off by heart, but I had never held one of these beautifully produced editions. It was the 9th edition, revised and corrected, January 1925, of the Spiritualist National Union Hymn Book. He played the organ for the Spiritualist churches where he lived. I told Constance that she should not only keep the hymn book, but that she could get messages from her grandfather from it. I explained how I had always not only used the method for myself, but also advised others to apply this simple and effective method to receive simple communication from loved ones in spirit for themselves. I also told her that she'd obviously been prompted to bring the book to me so that she would get a message from him. So there in the garden, I told my neighbour to close her eyes, ask her granddad for a message, open her eyes, open the book, and at whichever page it opened, and where her eye was first drawn, to read the text. Well, I read it for her when she showed me the place on the page that she had first set eyes on. It was a really evidential verse that talked about remembering the past and how love never dies. Then we discovered a bright blue feather marking a page, and on another a cutting from a Spiritualist newspaper, a picture of Jesus with the caption, "Norwich Church accepts the leadership of Jesus Christ in addition to the Union's 7 tenets." Constance began telling me about her family, now all in spirit, and how there were a couple of occasions that had stuck in her mind. Like the time her Aunt Hilda had suddenly announced that her aunt, Harry's sister Rona, had passed on, and it turned out that she was correct. And before the family had been informed that Ronnie Elwood had been killed in an explosion at his works, his wife Verona, Harry's daughter, heard him come in early, as she thought, and called out to him when she heard the door open and close. I took a couple of photos of the hymn book and a picture of a dedicated spiritualist and organist who gave so many upliftment with his musical talent. According to his notes, he wrote on the inside covers, he was at Barrow, 1894 to 1896, Manchester, 1913 to 1914, Ulverston, 1932 to 1933, and Barrow, 1933 to... Harry Wedge never filled that in with what we know as the end date, as it's called, but we know as spiritualists that it certainly wasn't the end. So time really is relative. There. So that's the article that I wrote, and I hope that you enjoyed that little insight and into a very interesting occurrence, a spiritual and spiritualistic occurrence. And I trust that you might take a leaf out of that book, literally. And if you have a nice little hymn book, or if you have a nice book of poems, that you can use that in the same way. You just close your eyes, ask if you can have a message, and then open it, and wherever the eye falls, you then read that few lines to yourself, and believe me, it will be very evidential. So I'll say cheerio for now, and I was glad to be able to speak to you. Bye for now. Bye.